Greetings, fellow poetry lovers, and welcome to this episode of the Social Distance Reading Series, a project of Vermont College and Green Mountains Review. I'm Wesley McNair, and I've been asked by those two sponsors to introduce myself as a poet. So I'll just say that I've been writing poetry for many years now. Maybe you can tell that by looking at me. And at this point, I have several collections to my credit, 8 of them from David R. Godine. The last 2 are The Unfastening, and after that, The Lost Child, which won the PEN New England Award in 2015. This brings me to my new collection, my 10th, which I want to read 4 or 5 poems from. Its title is Dwellers in the House of the Lord, and it's just out from David Godine and available on their website at godine.com and elsewhere. So let me describe my book to you. I have a copy of it here. I don't know if you can make it out through the camera of this laptop of mine, but that'll give you a sense. I think you can make out the title, Dwellers in the House of the Lord. Once again, there are some references to the book in that cover that you see. We'll get to those references in a little bit. So let me describe this book to you if I can. It's an unusual book for me in that it contains just one poem, a long narrative poem. And the poem has 2 stories in it that they unfold at the same time and kind of bump up against each other, setting off sparks. They didn't begin as stories, really. They began before I started the book back in 2016. They began as worries that I had that sometimes got me up in the middle of the night. And one of them was the worry I had about my younger sister, Amy. I got the news that she had Pick's disease, which is a rare, fast-moving form of dementia that tends to strike younger people. She was in her 50s when she was afflicted. So I worried about that. And I worried about all the trouble that Amy had in her life, particularly the trouble she had in her marriage with my brother-in-law, Mike, who owned a gun shop in rural Virginia and was full of anger. And yet the more I thought about my sister, the more I realized that her life wasn't all sadness, because she had this remarkable, loving spirit that everybody noticed. And it was through that loving spirit of hers that she was able to bring a reconciliation in the end to her marriage and to her family. And I wanted to write a story about exactly how that happened. And along the way, of course, I wanted to pay tribute to that loving spirit of hers. But back in 2016, I had this other worry, which became the second story of my poem. And it was Trump's rise to power in the White House through his campaign of 2016. This was a story not of love, but of fear. I'm sure you recall the fear of immigrants with which Trump began his campaign, and the fear baiting went on from there. You may also remember that he gave an interview with Bob Woodward in the White House in which he called fear his most important political weapon. So I thought if I could intersect my 2 stories, the small, intimate family story of reconciliation and the big national story, the big noisy story of fear and anger and divisiveness, I could not only honor my sister, but I could help people to understand our politics in a deeper way, which is poetry's way. I mentioned immigrants. There are immigrants in my family story too, but they're not villains in some made-for-TV drama intended to scare people. These are real-life immigrants, real-life refugees from my own family, uh, who probably resemble the immigrants in your family too, in that they deserve to be valued for their struggle and their American dream. But I have a limited time here, and I have some pages in front of me so I can read other poems. And I want to start with the core of my family story, which is the trouble in Amy's marriage, which I mentioned, her marriage to Mike. So here is section 6 in part 1. In the years after she married, Amy had Sophia, named after Mike's mother, then Lena, giving birth also to a love and hope that went deeper than the fear she felt for herself, though now she was afraid for her girls. Each day as they grew up, she lifted the invisible wet finger of her worry, testing for currents of inclement weather inside her house. Don't bother your father is what I say on the bad days, she tells me on the phone. He's never hit anybody, she adds, to comfort me. I don't think he ever would. In the photo Amy mailed of her yellow and orange beech tree in the fall, I see for the first time the house in Abner where she started again. Over one of its 2 front doors, a sign says, guns. I continue with 2 poems from section 7. I mentioned poems, by the way, not to confuse you. This is one long narrative poem, which consists of smaller poems that tell the story one by one. This is one of those. This is my favorite tree. It bears leaves all year round, Amy wrote on the back of the picture she sent, meaning I understood how the beautiful leaves flung high above the house had nothing to do with the troubles inside it. Like Lena's drawings of birds, which sometimes made her cry, she told me later in a phone call. They were so hopeful. But on the day she called about the church she and Lena and Sophia had found, Mike now busy behind the kitchen door in his gun shop, it was she who was hopeful, the bright tones of her voice still in my mind. It wasn't strict and plain like Michael's church, she said. It was made from somebody's home, with a funny tin hat built onto the front of it. And when we went inside, it felt mismatched and comfortable like a home. The worship room you could see used to be 2 rooms, she said, and there were curtains on the windows beside pictures of Jesus and the heart of Jesus with a key in it, and rows of mixed up wooden chairs and different colored plastic chairs. But what really struck my sister, she said, was the woman who started weeping while the preacher, Pastor Chris, was leading the hymn about Christ's love, weeping so loud, she said, that Pastor Debbie went over and held her. And I started to cry too, right in front of the kids, because I saw that the woman without love was me. And then, she said, midway through Pastor Chris's sermon about the loving mansions in the palace of heaven, this old man stood up and began shouting things that scared me at first because they didn't seem to make any sense, until I finally saw it was his need he meant, which felt like my own need, she added, whispering it. And this warmth started in my chest and traveled all the way down to my legs like thawing out. And I stood up with the others and shouted, Amen. I couldn't help it, Wesley. Amen for the man, and amen for everybody around me in this church out in nowhere, which felt like a loving mansion too. Longing was what Amy learned when she returned, often by herself, in the months afterward. How, if she shut her eyes as Pastor Chris spoke in his sad voice about the thirst for Christ's love, she could almost feel the quenching on her tongue. And how, by standing with her hands out and dreaming his sermon about the woman who touched the robe of Jesus, she could sense it on the tips of her fingers, as if she were no longer bound by time, but awake in the reborn self he had promised, leaving the one her mother and Mike had ridiculed far behind. Sometimes, my sister said, she thought she was a little like Jesus, each of them hiding a secret awareness from unbelievers that meant them harm. He, through his parables about new wineskins and fruit trees; she, by telling Mike that God had helped her find her way and meaning; the women at the local shelter she visited on grocery days, lingering afterward beside her favorite field to feed fresh carrots to the horses. For as years passed and my nieces one by one left home for college, Amy had begun to long for her own life. Meanwhile, just for a little contrast, over to my brother-in-law, Mike. We go to part 2, in which Mike discovers Donald Trump as a candidate for president in 2016. So, part 1, section 2. I don't know exactly how Mike responds when he sees Trump for the first time on TV, but I know Mike. How he might laugh at first at the ridiculous fake hair, then, just before clicking to a cop show, get interested in the way Trump keeps calling the runty guy from Florida Little Marco with a sneer, and makes them all seem little, especially the moderators sitting at their desks like teachers with trick questions. Why would Mexico pay for your border wall to keep Mexicans out? Or what about race relations, their big issue, while the country goes to hell? In a moment like watching the bored, disgusted face of Trump as he turns to take on the moderators too, Mike discovers what he's always known. It's the bullshit rules and the people in charge who make them up that have been holding him and the whole damn country back. Now, when he searches on the television for Trump and finds him wearing a cap over the shock of orange hair that ignited the anger he's carried since childhood, he misses it. And finally, this one last sample from Dwellers in the House of the Lord, in which Amy makes her escape. This section begins with quotations from Trump. All of the quotations from Trump, where they happen in this poem, have been carefully researched. So these are the words he actually said. The illegals are taking our jobs, Trump says on the campaign trail in Richmond. They're taking everything, including our money. This is not going to happen anymore. Build the wall, the audience chants. Build the wall. My sister Amy does not understand politics. All she thinks about as she starts down the road she's known for 20 years and sees the Trump signs is Mike erupting at the blacks on TV, and the hatred in the gun shop, and the blessed lightness she feels as she sends it all, sign by sign, into a rearview mirror. Beside her, in my mind, holding an imaginary cat crate, as she drives toward freedom. I feel the lightness too, though I worry about the desperation of the stained double wide and ruined cape we pass, and the backyard with bed springs and refrigerators and a Confederate flag. Nod, Amy. When I glance over at her, she stares straight ahead, only turning to look at the broad green field she loves, where one of the horses seems to run with us. For after her long struggle, she's living the dream she's dreamed for years. Never mind the closed knitting factory we approach, then send behind us, and the big box stores that replaced Main Street, and the high, indifferent clock of the Bank of America. My sister is lowering the windows and singing the old loving hymn about being lost and found that we once learned in our mother's church. And I, the worrier, the man of little faith, I'm singing it too. That dream of love and home that drives Amy is not hers alone. It begins in the book with immigrant grandparents and parents who gathered their children up and brought them here in their original American dream of home, which they passed on to Amy and to me, and even to Mike, as you'll see in the conclusion of this poem. And what carried me through the telling of this family story, fitting the generations together and staying true to their struggle and their dream, was a need I felt to take my American story back. Every American president becomes, among other things, the narrator in chief of the nation's story, of America's story, getting to tell it any way he wants to. But the way Trump has chosen to tell the story is so corrupted with fear and divisiveness and lies that there's no hope in it. There's no love in it. There's no dream in it. So I have one wish for the readers of this book, and it is that they will consider making the book a model for them in taking their own American stories back, in telling them past to present to themselves and to their families, because those stories, your story and mine, contain the truth of America, never mind the current turn in our politics. And I can think of no better project than this, actually, in this moment when we're hunkering down with our families and the coronavirus swirls outside our houses doing its damage. There's going to be a lot of rebuilding to do when we come back out of our houses. And I can think of no more fitting way to begin that process. So I'll just close by saying, happy reading. Thanks for joining me, and stay safe.